tough guy meets television's king of sarcasm, and the conversation takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history, a heated exchange that got so intense, security had to step in. This is the story of how Clint Eastwood, the man who made careers out of squinting at bad guys and delivering iconic one-liners, found himself in a verbal showdown with David Letterman that ended with the Hollywood icon being escorted right off the set. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story has twists that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about these two entertainment legends. The Ed Sullivan Theater was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members chatted excitedly, knowing they were about to witness something special. Clint Eastwood, at the height of his directorial acclaim, was scheduled to appear on The Late Show to promote his latest film. What started as a routine promotional visit would spiral into television infamy. David Letterman bounced onto the stage with his trademark gap-toothed grin, feeding off the audience's energy as he delivered his opening monologue. The crowd was particularly enthusiastic tonight, knowing that one of cinema's most respected figures would be gracing the guest chair. Letterman had built his reputation on his ability to make even the most seasoned celebrities squirm with his unpredictable interview style. But tonight, he was about to meet his match. Ladies and gentlemen, our first guest tonight is a man who has been making movies for over 4 decades, Letterman announced to the audience, his voice carrying that familiar hint of mischief. He's directed and starred in some of the greatest westerns ever made, he's won Academy Awards, and he's probably the only person in Hollywood who can make me feel short. Please, welcome Clint Eastwood. The audience erupted as Eastwood walked out, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure even at his advanced age. He moved with that characteristic slow, measured pace that had become his trademark, each step deliberate and confident. The applause seemed to go on forever as he acknowledged the crowd with a subtle nod before settling into the guest chair next to Letterman's desk. "Clint, great to have you here," Letterman began, leaning back in his chair with a smile that seemed genuine enough. "You know, I've been watching your movies since I was a kid, and I have to ask, do you ever get tired of people asking you to say, 'Make my day'?" Eastwood's response was measured, his voice carrying that gravelly tone that had become iconic. "Well, Dave, I figure if people are still interested in hearing it after all these years, I must have done something right. Though I have to say, it gets a little old when grocery store clerks start quoting my lines while they're bagging my groceries." The audience chuckled, and Letterman seemed pleased with the response. "Now, you've been making movies for a long time, directing them too. Tell me, when you're behind the camera, are you as tough on your actors as Dirty Harry was on Criminals?" "I like to think I'm fair," Eastwood replied, shifting slightly in his chair. "But I don't have patience for people who aren't prepared or who waste time on set. Time is money, and more importantly, time is something you can't get back." Letterman nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was gearing up for something more provocative. "That's interesting because I heard a story about you and one of your co-stars, and I'm wondering if you might set the record straight for us." Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle change that anyone familiar with his films would recognize as a warning sign. "What story would that be, Dave?" "Well," Letterman continued, his voice taking on that tone he used when he was about to poke at something sensitive. "I heard that during the filming of one of your recent movies, you had what some might call a disagreement with one of your leading ladies. Something about her method-acting approach not meshing well with your, shall we say, more direct style of filmmaking." The audience sensed the shift in tone, the comfortable banter giving way to something more charged. Eastwood's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his jaw setting in a way that fans of his westerns would have immediately recognized. "Dave, I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I think you might want to check your sources," Eastwood said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've worked with a lot of talented people over the years, and I've always treated everyone with respect." Letterman, either not picking up on the warning signs or choosing to ignore them, pressed forward. "Oh, come on, Clint. We're all adults here. I'm not talking about anything scandalous. I'm just curious about how someone with your reputation for efficiency deals with actors who might want to explore their character's motivation for 20 minutes before delivering a simple line." "My reputation," Eastwood repeated slowly, his voice dropping to that familiar low register that had made villains tremble in dozens of films, "is based on making good movies and working with professional people. I'm not interested in discussing private conversations or creative differences that might have happened on any of my sets. The audience was quiet now, sensing the tension building between the two men. Letterman, who had made a career out of pushing boundaries, seemed to realize he was entering dangerous territory, but his showman instincts kept him moving forward. Fair enough, Letterman said, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. I'm just trying to give our audience some insight into how one of Hollywood's greatest directors works. But since we're talking about your process, let me ask you this. Do you ever watch your old movies and cringe at anything? Eastwood seemed to relax slightly at the change of direction. I think any artist looks back at their work and sees things they might do differently. But I don't spend a lot of time dwelling on the past. I'm more interested in what's next. That's very zen of you, Letterman replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't quite ready to let the previous topic go. But speaking of the past, I have to ask about some of the things you've said in interviews over the years. You've never been one to shy away from expressing your opinions, have you? And there it was. The moment when the interview began to shift from promotional chat to something more confrontational. Eastwood's eyes locked onto Letterman's, and anyone who had ever watched a standoff in a spaghetti western knew exactly what that look meant. Dave, I think you should be very careful about where this conversation is heading, Eastwood said, his voice carrying that unmistakable warning tone that had made him famous. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunfighter's pistol. Letterman, perhaps misreading the situation or driven by his compulsion to push buttons, leaned forward with a grin that was more predatory than friendly. Oh, come on, Clint. We're just having a conversation here. I'm talking about some of your more, let's say, colorful political statements over the years. You've never been shy about sharing your views. My political views are my own business, Eastwood replied, his hands resting calmly on the arms of his chair, but his knuckles showing the slightest hint of tension. I came here to talk about my movie, not to get into a political debate with a talk show host. The audience was completely silent now, the usual murmur and shuffling that accompanied late-night television nowhere to be heard. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something unprecedented was happening. But that's just it, Letterman continued, seemingly unable to stop himself from digging deeper. You've made your political views very public. You've endorsed candidates, you've made statements at rallies. You even had that famous conversation with an empty chair. Surely you can't be surprised that people want to discuss these things. Eastwood's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that had made audiences believe he could outdraw any gunslinger. That conversation, as you call it, was a creative choice that I made at a political event. It had nothing to do with my work as a filmmaker, and it certainly has nothing to do with why I'm sitting in this chair tonight. But it does, though, doesn't it? Letterman pressed, his showman instincts overriding any sense of self-preservation. I mean, when you're as famous as you are, everything becomes part of your public persona. Your politics, your personal life, your opinions, they all become fair game. Fair game? Eastwood repeated, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow becoming more menacing as it got quieter. Let me tell you something about fair game, Dave. Fair game is when two people agree to the rules before they start playing. What you're doing right now isn't fair game. It's an ambush. Letterman's smile flickered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. An ambush? Clint, we're on television. This is what we do. We talk about current events. We discuss what's happening in the world. Your opinions are part of that world. My opinions? Eastwood said, rising slightly in his chair as if preparing to stand, are formed by decades of life experience, by seeing this country change, by working with people from every walk of life. They're not sound bites for your entertainment. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Letterman's band members, usually invisible during interviews, were now clearly visible in the background, their instruments silent as they watched the confrontation unfold. The audience sat frozen, witnessing what was clearly becoming television history. Look, Clint, Letterman said, his voice taking on a slightly more conciliatory tone, I'm not trying to attack you here. I'm just asking questions that a lot of people are curious about. You're a public figure, you've put yourself out there, and people want to understand where you're coming from. People want to understand? Eastwood's voice rose for the first time. Not to a shout, but to a level that carried clearly across the silent studio. Or do you want to create a moment for your show? Do you want to get Clint Eastwood riled up so you can play the clip tomorrow on the morning shows? Letterman's face flushed slightly, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed genuinely rattled. That's not what this is about. Isn't it? Eastwood challenged, now leaning forward in his chair, his famous squint more pronounced than ever. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me here under the pretense of talking about my work, and now you're trying to turn this into some kind of political theater. I'm just doing my job, Letterman replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Your job, Eastwood said, his voice carrying a tone of disgust, is supposed to be entertaining people, making them laugh, maybe having an interesting conversation. Your job isn't supposed to be playing gotcha journalism with guests who come here in good faith. The confrontation was escalating beyond anything anyone in the studio had expected. Letterman, who had built his career on his ability to handle difficult guests and uncomfortable situations, seemed to be losing control of his own show. Clint, I think you're overreacting, Letterman said, attempting to regain his footing. We're just talking here. If you don't want to discuss your politics, we can talk about something else. Overreacting? Eastwood's voice was now carrying that dangerous quiet that movie audiences knew meant someone was about to face consequences. You ambush me with questions about my personal beliefs. You suggest that my creative choices are fair game for your comedy routine, and when I push back, you tell me I'm overreacting? Letterman spread his hands in what was supposed to be a calming gesture. I'm just saying we can move on to something else if this topic makes you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? Eastwood stood up from his chair, his full height now towering over the seated talk show host. Dave, I've been uncomfortable plenty of times in my life. I've been uncomfortable hanging off cliffs for movie stunts. I've been uncomfortable directing scenes with difficult actors. I've been uncomfortable at political events where I knew half the room disagreed with everything I believed. But you know what I've never been uncomfortable with? Standing up for myself when someone tries to make me look like a fool. The audience gasped audibly as Eastwood rose, and several camera operators instinctively adjusted their shots to capture the dramatic moment. Letterman remained seated, but his usual composure was clearly shaken. Nobody's trying to make you look like a fool, Letterman said, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. Then what would you call this? Eastwood demanded, gesturing toward the host. You bring me on your show, you pretend you want to talk about my movie, and then you spend the entire interview trying to get me to say something controversial about my political beliefs. If that's not trying to make me look like a fool, then what is it? The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning was audible. Letterman, for perhaps the first time in his television career, seemed at a complete loss for words. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I'll tell you what it is, Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and experience. It's cheap. It's the kind of lazy television that treats guests like carnival attractions instead of human beings, and I won't be part of it. And with that declaration, the legendary actor and director began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. The confrontation had reached a point of no return, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Letterman finally found his voice as he watched his guest removing the microphone pack. Clint. Wait, please. Let's just take a breath here. We don't need to end things like this. Eastwood paused, the microphone halfway off, and looked directly at Letterman with those piercing eyes that had stared down countless movie villains. End things like what, Dave? With honesty? With someone finally calling you out for turning a simple interview into a circus act? That's not what this is, Letterman protested, rising from his chair now, his hands extended in a pleading gesture. Look, maybe I pushed a little too hard, maybe I asked the wrong questions, but we're both professionals here. We can work this out. Professionals? Eastwood's voice carried a bitter laugh. A professional would have respected the fact that I came here to promote my work, not to be your political punching bag. A professional would have done his homework and prepared questions about the craft of filmmaking, about the story I'm trying to tell, about the people I worked with on this picture. The audience was transfixed, many of them holding their breath as they watched the confrontation unfold. Some had pulled out their phones, though security would later confiscate any footage. This was television history happening in real time, and everyone knew it. Letterman took a step closer to his guest. "You're right, okay? You're absolutely right. I should have focused on your movie. I should have asked about your directing process, about working with your cast. Let's start over. Please, sit back down, and we'll talk about what you came here to talk about." Eastwood shook his head slowly, a gesture that somehow carried more finality than any dramatic declaration. "Dave, you don't get to rewind the tape. You don't get to take back the last 15 minutes and pretend they didn't happen. You showed your true colors tonight, and now I'm showing mine." "What does that mean?" Letterman asked, though the desperation in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "It means that I don't work with people I can't trust," Eastwood replied, his voice steady and resolute. "And right now, I don't trust you as far as I could throw you. Which, at my age, isn't very far." The comment drew a few nervous chuckles from the audience, but the tension in the room was far from broken. If anything, Eastwood's calm demeanor was making the situation more unsettling than if he had simply lost his temper. Letterman made one last desperate attempt to salvage the interview. "Clint, please. I've been doing this show for years. I've interviewed thousands of guests. Sometimes things get a little heated, sometimes we push boundaries. That's what makes for good television. But it doesn't mean we can't find our way back to a civil conversation." "Good television?" Eastwood's eyebrows raised slightly, and his voice took on a tone of genuine curiosity, as if he was truly puzzled by the concept. "You think ambushing your guests makes for good television? You think trying to embarrass someone who came here in good faith makes for good television?" "I think honest conversations make for good television," Letterman replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Honest?" Eastwood repeated the word as if he was tasting something unpleasant. "There was nothing honest about what just happened here, Dave. You had an agenda from the moment I walked out here. You wanted to get me to say something controversial, something you could use to generate buzz for your show. That's not honest. That's manipulative." The silence that followed was deafening. Letterman stood there, his usual quick wit completely abandoned, while Eastwood continued to remove his microphone with the same methodical precision he brought to everything he did. "You know what's funny?" Eastwood said, though there was no humor in his voice. "I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've dealt with studio executives who tried to cheat me, directors who tried to humiliate me, critics who tried to destroy me. But I've never had someone invite me to their home, so to speak, and then try to make me look like a fool in front of millions of people. That wasn't my intention," Letterman said weakly. "Your intention?" Eastwood's voice rose slightly, the first time he had shown real anger rather than controlled disappointment. "Your intention was to use me to create a moment, to get people talking about your show tomorrow morning. Well, congratulations, Dave. Mission accomplished. People will definitely be talking about this." At this point, the show's producers were clearly visible in the wings, gesturing frantically to the stage manager. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and everyone behind the scenes was scrambling to figure out how to handle it. Letterman noticed the activity in his peripheral vision and seemed to realize that his staff was preparing for damage control. "Clint, look, maybe we both said some things we didn't mean. Maybe we both got a little carried away. But we're live on television here. We've got an audience. We've got people watching at home. Can't we find a way to end this on a better note?" Eastwood had finished removing his microphone and now held it in his hand like a piece of evidence. "You want to end this on a better note? Here's how we end this on a better note, Dave. You learned something from tonight. You learned that guests aren't props for your entertainment. You learned that when someone trusts you enough to come on your show, you don't betray that trust by trying to make them into a caricature of themselves." "I hear what you're saying," Letterman replied, nodding rapidly. "I really do. And you're right. I should have been more respectful. I should have stuck to questions about your film." "Should've, could've, would've," Eastwood said, placing the microphone on Letterman's desk with a deliberate thud. "That's the story of a lot of lives, Dave. But here's the thing about should have. It doesn't mean much once the moment has passed." The legendary actor turned toward the audience, and for a moment, it seemed like he might address them directly. Instead, he simply nodded once. A gesture of acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both disappointment and dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent studio without amplification. "I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got a lesson in what happens when television forgets its responsibility to its guests and its audience." With that, Clint Eastwood began walking toward the stage exit, his long strides carrying him away from the desk, away from Letterman, and away from what had become an untenable situation. But he wasn't quite finished. He stopped just before reaching the wings and turned back toward Letterman one final time. "You know, Dave, in all my years in Westerns, the bad guys always thought they were clever. They thought they could outdraw the hero through tricks and deception. But there's one thing they never understood, and apparently one thing you don't understand either." "What's that?" Letterman asked, his voice barely audible. Eastwood's famous squint returned, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the authority of every character he had ever played. "You can't outdraw a man who refuses to play your game." And with that final pronouncement, Clint Eastwood walked off the Late Show stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, a speechless host, and a moment that would become legend in television history. The cameras continued rolling as Letterman stood alone at his desk, holding the abandoned microphone, while the sound of Eastwood's footsteps echoed through the theater until they finally disappeared into silence. The most extraordinary part wasn't just that Clint Eastwood had walked off a major television show. It was that he had done it with such dignity and control that even his exit felt like a master class in how to handle an impossible situation. He had turned what could have been an embarrassing confrontation into a statement about integrity, respect, and the courage to stand up for your principles, even when the whole world is watching. What did you think of this legendary confrontation between two entertainment icons? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think Eastwood was justified in walking off, or if Letterman was just doing his job as an interviewer. And don't forget to subscribe.